I think we can start. Welcome everyone to this webinar of organized by the History and Political Economy of Business and Finance Research Cluster, which is a research cluster within the Faculty of Business and Law at the Open University. And I'm very happy to have Davide Villani with us today, which is an associate lecturer in economics at Goldsmith College, and he recently got his PhD from the Open University. And his research interest range covers political economy, financialization, and import-output economics, which is the topic of the presentation today, and is a framework that Davide applied also within a project sponsored by the European Space Agency. So without further ado, I will thank Davide for presenting to us today. And so Davide, you will have 40 minutes for your presentation, and then as usual, we will have a Q&A session with all the attendees. Okay, the floor is yours. Thanks, Davide.
All right, fantastic. Well, thanks a lot, Daniele. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for being here today at this seminar. So yes, this is a paper that I wrote recently in the aftermath of the COVID-19 outbreaks, and it involves some consideration regarding productive integration in Europe. As we know, the effects of the current economic crisis are likely to be prolonged, and some analysts already mentioned that this economic downturn is the biggest since the Great Depression. Now, of course, there are a lot of studies that have been published in the last months that deal with the economic consequences of the COVID-19 crisis. Most of these studies are concerned with aggregate figures on the impact that the crisis has on GDP, while other studies deal with the direct economic consequences on industries and sectors. However, these studies usually neglect the indirect impact that the economic lockdown and the fall in final demand has on all the supply chain that is involved in industries. As we know from the literature on global value chain and the literature on the role of intermediate goods, what we need to do in order to assess the impact of a fall or a growth in final demand is not only the evaluation of the direct impact on the industry, but also the indirect impact on the industries that provide intermediate goods to a certain industry under study. Therefore, what is important, I believe, for a thorough assessment of the implication of the external shock on the productive system is to focus not only on the direct effects on the specific industry and in a specific country, but also all the productive linkages that exist along the supply chain domestically and in other countries. Of course, this is also a relevant topic in order for us to discuss about industrial policies, since I will argue uncoordinated actions of industrial policies might be ineffective or insufficient to meet a desired objective. This discussion also is framed within a broader discussion regarding the restructuring, the modification of the productive structure in Europe and worldwide, such as processes of reshoring. There is a big question going around, which is if COVID-19 crisis will revert the trend of globalization that we have witnessed in the last decades. So, the objectives of this paper that I will try to assess is to map the degree of productive integration of 4 productive activities in Europe. I will only focus on 4 activities. And in particular, I will focus on the role of foreign demand in the generation of employment, in the production of exported intermediate inputs and final goods. I will distinguish, as you will see in a few minutes, between these categories. Then I will also try to provide a preliminary assessment of the potential impact of the ongoing economic crisis on employment, on the level of employment in some manufacturing activities across Europe. The methodological approach that I use is the notion of subsystem analysis that was introduced by Sraffa and then was developed in other papers, more importantly by Pasinetti, with the notion of vertically integrated labor. The key aspect of this approach is that it enables to quantify the amount of employment that is demanded directly and indirectly. And by indirectly, I mean that is embodied in the production of intermediate inputs for a final production of goods. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the subsystem type of analysis, here I show that what's the difference between the standard industry level analysis and the subsystem type of analysis, which is often indicated as vertically integrated sector analysis. So to answer to a simple question like how many workers are needed to produce a car or how many workers are employed in the automotive sector, from the industry level perspective, what you would do is just to focus on the number of employed people within the automotive industry. This is a straightforward measure, so this is relatively easy to calculate. You just go to the standard national statistics, you get the data, and you have the number of people employed in the automotive system. However, it also has some cons, that is that it does not consider the indirect spillovers on other industries. At the same time, this type of measurement are affected by the process of outsourcing and do not quantify the people that are involved in the process of outsourcing. Differently, the subsystem type of analysis, what it does, it accounts for the direct effect, that is how many workers are employed in the automotive industry in the final production of cars, but also it quantifies the indirect effect on the industries that provide intermediate goods to the automotive industry, and also all the indirect effect of the industries that provide intermediate goods to the intermediate goods industries, and so on and so forth. So basically, it is a chain that prolongs in time and in different steps. So for example, within the subsystem approach, we are able to calculate, to account for the amount of workers that are needed in the rubber industries to produce tires that are then employed in the production of cars. Then it goes further, as it also accounts, for example, for the workers that are employed in the oil industries that are needed to produce tires that enter into the final production, that is car. So as you can see, we are able to map all the productive relations, all the supply chains basically involved in the production of car. So this is the main pro of this approach. This is the main benefit. It's also very important if you want to take into account the process of outsourcing and how this contributes to the production of final goods. However, on the other hand, it's not always easy or possible to calculate because it's not as straightforward as the industry level analysis. Now, here there are briefly just some methodological aspects. As I mentioned at the beginning, I focus mainly on 4 activities. These 4 activities are manufacturing of motor vehicles, manufacture of other transport equipment, then the manufacture of computers, electronics, and optical goods, and finally, manufacture of textiles. In the empirical analysis, I use the Word Input-Output database, WIOD, which is the standard database employed in multi-sectoral, multi-country input-output analysis. One of the main limitations of the study is that the latest available year is 2014, and therefore the estimates refer to the productive structure that was in place in 2013. Another aspect that I would like to highlight is that the estimation that I will report are based on physical units, that is the number of people, the number of workers that are needed to produce a certain amount of output. And therefore, these units are not influenced by wage differentials across countries, which is usually the case when we employ other type of offshoring, other type of input-output measures that are based, for instance, on value added, okay? So in this case, we have a physical measure which is not affected by wage differentials across countries. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen, you see the analytical framework. For those who are familiar with this type of analysis, with input-output analysis, it is pretty much straightforward. We obtain a matrix of vertically integrated labor, which is calculated by pre-multiplying the diagonalized vector of direct labor coefficients for the Leontief matrix, which multiplies then the diagonalized vector of final demand. So basically, we obtain a matrix in which each cell of the matrix indicates the amount of labor that is directly and indirectly required for the production of a certain amount of output and it also identifies, it also gives information regarding the origins, that is the industry and the country of origins of the supply chain. As I mentioned at the beginning, what I'm going to do is to break up employment at the subsystem level. Once I have calculated the total employment by subsystem, that is again the direct and indirect labor required to produce total final output in a certain activity, what I do is to decompose this total employment into three categories. The first category is the employment that is required, that is embodied in the production of exported intermediate inputs. The second category is the employment that is embodied in the domestic production of final goods, which are then exported to be consumed somewhere else. And the third group of analysis involves the employment which is embodied in the domestic production of final good, but is consumed domestically. Okay, so therefore, the second and third level of analysis here involve what I define the domestic employment. Okay, just to characterize the employment that is not exported as intermediate input. Okay, so these are the three groups of categories. Now, broadly speaking, exported intermediate labor provides somehow an assessment of the degree of reliance or dependence, if you like, on foreign demand of intermediate goods of a certain countries, while the exporting final goods provide an assessment the degree of dependence that a certain country, a certain production has on foreign demand. Now, I will move to the results of my study. Here we see the difference between the levels of total employment by activity if we measure them according to the standard industry level analysis, or if we measure them according to the subsystem level of analysis. What we can see here is that once we consider also the indirect effects, that is, the employment generated along the supply chain, not necessarily within the the industry of analysis, we see that the number of people involved in Europe increased considerably compared to the standard industry level type of analysis. Overall, we have that roughly 20% of employment in manufacturing, we have that these four activities represent roughly 20% of the employment in the manufacturing at the industry level, while if we account for the manufacturing at the subsystem level, these four activities represent around 36% of total employment in manufacturing. So this is just to give you a flavor of the importance of the productive linkages and the importance of these four subsystems in Europe. Here we see the results for the aggregate European Union. Then, as I mentioned at the beginning, offshoring is increasing in terms of importance, and this figure here shows the importance of offshoring in the four subsystem analyzed here. We have the bars indicate the amount, the share of employment that is involved in the production of exported intermediate inputs. Employment that is basically a measure, if you like, of offshoring. We see that between 2000 and 2014, this share, that is the amount of workers that work basically to produce intermediate goods that are then exported to be assembled in other countries, increases everywhere, increases in all activities, and is especially marked in the automotive and other transportation activities, where nearly 50% of total labor is labor that is involved in trade of intermediate exported inputs of production. Okay, so we can see that it's very important. Also, this figure shows you that the total number of employed has actually decreased between 2000 and 2014. This might be due to a number of factors, such as the general process of the industrialization that we witness in Europe, but also the process of offshoring from European manufacturing towards extra-European countries, okay? But as you can see, the decline is very, very marked in most activities, with the exception of other transportation, where the absolute level of activity of employed are rather stable. Now, let's focus on the relative importance of the four subsystems in each country in Europe. This table basically shows different aspects. Columns that go from 1 to 4, what they do is to express the ratio of employment that is generated in each country over the total employment in the subsystem, while column 5 expresses the ratio of total employment in a country over total European employment. Therefore, what these data indicate is the relative importance of each subsystem in each country. When the values in column 1 to 4 are higher than the value in column 5, it means that that subsystem in that country is relatively more important compared to the average participation of that country in the European labor force. And well, from these results, what we see is that the four subsystems that we're analyzing here are particularly important for Eastern European countries and Germany. That is, these four subsystems generate more employment than the average in Eastern European countries and in Germany. If we look at Southern European countries, what we see is that the only activity in which they are specialized is textiles, which is the only low-tech activity among the four that I'm looking at here. So I think this is somehow interesting to denote a sort of difference between core and periphery specialization in manufacturing in Europe. At the same time, the rest of countries don't have a clear pattern with respect to these four manufacturing activities. So we have a more heterogeneous position of these countries facing the insertion of these four activities. Now, remember the composition of total employment by subsystem. Now what I will do is to focus specifically on the employment embodied in the production of exported intermediate inputs. Now, this map here shows basically the share of labor involved in the production of exported intermediate inputs by subsystem and by country, okay? So the darker is the country, the higher is the share of the employment involved in the production of intermediate inputs of production that are then exported to other countries to be assembled in third countries. What we see from this analysis is that this share of exported intermediate goods is especially high in Eastern European countries, especially with respect to the automotive and other transportation subsystem. We see also that in Germany, the great majority of employment is not involved in the production of exported intermediate inputs. That is, it is involved in the production of final goods. That is, Germany is more involved in the final stages of production, if you like, while Eastern European countries are more involved at early stages of production. At the same time, we see that the employment structure in the textile subsystem relies more on domestic production. That is, the employment that is absorbed by the export of intermediate inputs in the textile subsystem is relatively low compared to other countries. Now, again, what I do is to focus on the so-called domestic type of employment, that is the employment that is needed for the production of final goods domestically, which are then exported to other countries and to be consumed in other countries. And the employment in the domestic production of final goods, which are eventually consumed domestically. Basically, all the employment this means that all the employment that is not involved in the production of exported intermediate inputs is embodied in the domestic supply chain of final goods, okay, which can finally be exported or consumed domestically. What we see, if we look at this part of the employment generation, is also the predominant role of exports in these four subsystems. If we look only at the so-called domestic employment, we see that between 49% and 69% of employment is involved in the production of final goods, which are eventually exported, okay? So this means basically that the majority of the employment in the four subsystems analyzed is involved in the production of exported goods. These goods are exported whether as intermediate inputs of production or as final goods, which are consumed in other countries. So this is a sort of static, if you like, representation of the productive structure in Europe concerning these four subsystems. Here, I briefly present an exercise, a very simple exercise that somehow tries to estimate a possible impact of the current COVID-19 crisis on employment. To perform this exercise, what I did was to use data from the report published by Baker and McKenzie a few months ago, which forecast for 2020 a fall in final demand in the production of automotive that is equal to minus 13%, minus 8% in the final demand of computer and electronics and textile goods, and minus 5% in the final demand of other transportation goods. Now, what I did was to assume, which I realize it is somehow a strong assumption, but I mean, we didn't have further elements not to use it. What I assume is that these impacts are evenly distributed across European countries, and what we see is that the employment at risk following this fall in demand is around 1.3 million of jobs in Europe only in 2020 due to this fall in demand. As you can see from the different colors of the bars in the figure, a great part of this fall involves exported intermediate inputs or the export of final demand. The only a minority of the employment is involved in the production of domestic goods. Of course, automotive is likely to be the subsystem that is going to be more affected, and this is because automotive is the biggest sectors in terms of employment generation among the 4 subsystems analyzed here, and because the estimates of Baker and McKenzie report a sharper decline in final demand for automotive compared to the other subsystems. Of course, we must take these results very, very carefully because my estimation is somehow a straightforward estimation, but of course, much of these results will depend on the actual consequences that the COVID-19 crisis will have in terms of activity reduction, and also it will depend largely on the measures that will be put in place by governments and other international institutions to contrast the crisis. So this is somehow, in this sense, it's a preliminary exercise. However, what I would like to do here is just to highlight the potentialities of the current crisis and also where in which subsystems are likely to be more affected and what part of the employment structure is going to be likely more affected by the current crisis. So now we are almost approaching the end of my presentation. First of all, what emerges from this analysis is the importance of the 4 subsystems analyzed here. There are more than 13 million people that whose job depend directly and or indirectly from the production of these 4 subsystems. At the same time, what I would like to highlight is the fundamental role of international trade. 2/3 of total employment is involved in international trade. 1/3 is involved in the production of exported intermediate goods. The other 1/3 is involved in the production of exported final goods. At the same time, what emerges from the analysis is the uneven distribution of the type of employment. We see that Eastern European countries are more involved as provider of exported intermediate inputs in the automotive and other transportation subsystem. This means that these countries are the labor force activated, the labor force generated in these countries relies considerably on the decisions regarding the organization of the supply chain, which are taken in 3rd countries. At the same time, Germany is somehow in a situation of more power compared to Eastern European countries, since these countries generate the majority of the employment in the production of final goods, not as intermediate goods. Finally, we see that Southern European countries are more specialized in the production of textile, which probably significantly it's the only low-tech activity among those analyzed here. And of course, this sort of distribution of employment reflects the literature regarding core and periphery in Europe and different division of labor in European countries. Finally, COVID-19 crisis is likely to have a great impact on employment, which I know is not a great news, but I mean, that's what we are already witnessing at the European level. Finally, I would also like to mention some policy implications that I believe emerge from this analysis. A first aspect is that domestic uncoordinated policies might be insufficient or ineffective in stimulating the economy. And this is because of the high degree of foreign spillovers. Okay, this is because the high degree of dependence of the employment in this subsystem on demand that is generated elsewhere. Therefore, stimulating domestic demand may not be so effective in stimulating this production given the current organization of the supply chain. Therefore, the logical somehow solution would be the implementation of coordinated industrial policies, at least at the European level, which ideally, and this is my personal opinion, should aim at reverting the existing disparities along the supply chain. But of course, we also know that the feasibility of the implementation of these coordinated industrial policies depends on many factors, which are mainly political and of course exceed the extent of my work. Finally, is COVID-19 crisis going to increase the reshoring processes in European manufacturing? Well, the short answer is that we don't know, or at least I don't know for sure. Now, the long answer might be that we still don't know. However, what we should consider when analyzing this question are the reasons that push the firms to offshore all or part of their activities. Have these reasons been altered by the current COVID-19 crisis or not? If these reasons have not been altered, for example, wage differential across countries, well, I believe that unless there is another prolonged production lockdown, which seems unlikely at the moment, or unless there are radical institutional reconfiguration, which also doesn't seem to be a really possible solution at the moment, I believe that it's reasonable to expect that the strong dependence on external markets will somehow persist. At the same time, it's not to exclude the opposite trend, that is a new wave of offshoring. And this is because firms may be willing to exploit even more the intra and extra-European wage differential that exists. That is, in a context of high unemployment, like the one we are witnessing at the moment, it's possible that increases in foreign wages might be somehow frozen, and therefore the wage differential between core and periphery be maintained, which may incentivize somehow the offshoring process. But of course, this is not a clear answer that I have. These are just elements that I put on the table, which might be of interest to be analyzed. So I stop here and happy to hear your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Davide. Thanks a lot for great presentation. So, as we said before, now the floor is open for questions and comments.